Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Will you get another stimulus check from the government sometime in 2020? Is there more money coming for small businesses? And what about your health care if you happen to get COVID-19? Well, the Democrats and Republicans have both proposed different levels of spending and are set to reconvene soon. Today, we will get to review exactly what we know about their proposals and explain whether it's likely Congress is actually going to do anything prior to the November 2020 election. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on stimulus packages, the government, and the 2020 election without
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Yeah, and if you want to follow along, Justin, the audience wants to follow along. This is a nice article by the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, I guess. But it puts it in 8 different charts, which I knew when I saw it, it was right up your alley. So they've broken down the stimulus packages of the Republicans and the Democrats into 8 different categories. We're going to talk about each one today. They've told us what they approved back in July and what both sides are saying currently in each of these 8 categories. So it makes for pretty easy reading and great and easy discussion points. So what are we going with first here?
I'm hoping, Lance, that if you and I can be efficient and get through this, get through the business of the day, that we might have time to explain to our producer the difference between a chart and a graph. Because when we're leading off and you're talking about these charts, it made me think, I wonder if some of our new listeners, if our producer, I don't think we've gone over those particulars, and that's
they don't know the story of charts and graphs, huh?
They do not. No, the
evolution
history,
of charts
yes.
and graphs in the life of True Chat.
That's right. That'll be my first book, the history of charts and graphs. So what we're going to look at in the first segment today, Lance, we're going to look at stimulus checks, small business aid, business tax credits and deductions, and aid to state and local governments. Then in the second segment, we'll look at unemployment benefits, so you definitely got to stay tuned for those, safety net and individual tax cuts, health care, and then kind of all the other provisions as well. And by the end of the third segment, charts and graphs.
That other provisions, usually, that's one that you kind of, when you see that, like the catch-all, you turn your nose up at it. But as I was looking at it, preparing for the show, there are a lot of things in there that I think would be of interest to people. So you need to stick around. I think we're going to hit just about everybody, and many people will be in multiple categories.
Yeah, I mean, if you care about higher education, agriculture, retirement or pension plans, anything like that, those are all grouped in that other provisions.
Post office, student loan, defense spending, defense contractors, airports. There's all kinds of stuff in that others package.
So here's what we got for the second round of stimulus checks. Both parties include a second round of stimulus checks for individuals. The Democratic plan is more costly, increasing the amount allotted for dependents to $1,200 from $500. So that's like if Lance has kids at home, right, that he's claiming as dependents on his taxes. During the first round of checks, you would have gotten $500 per kid. Now you could get $1,200 per kid under the Democrats' plan. And they also want to loosen rules for undocumented immigrants to receive money as well. So the Republican plan, Lance, it calls for $300 billion in the second round of stimulus checks versus the original $293 billion. So basically the Republicans are saying, let's just do what we did the first time. And the Democrats are saying, let's go from about $300 billion to $413 billion, and adding another $23 billion on top of that for undocumented immigrants or other people, loosening the rules to make it easier for other people to get access to that stimulus money. So that's your breakdown there.
Right. So you're looking at, as you said, the equal plan for the Republicans. Let's do it a second time. The Democrats want to up it about 25%, giving people more money who have children, who are living at home. I'm sure there's, the age requirement, not those families whose millennials have moved back home because they've lost their job. I don't think that they get their own $1,200 check, I'm assuming. But the problem is, right, as we've heard all of this, nobody, at least so far, has said we're going to talk about these individually. It's been an entire package. And, while you look at it, you would think there's some wiggle room here in this aspect of it, that they ought to be able to come up with something, because they both agree that a large amount of money ought to go back out to the people. You know what I'm saying? There's a little bit of an increase on the Democrats, but they're really pretty close. I mean, I know for those of us who work for minimum wage or on retirement or whatever, billions of dollars sounds like a lot of money. But when you look at the government spending, they're not really that far apart.
Right. Well, and again, it amounts to $1,200 for individuals. So, I mean, it's that, put it in perspective. We got 320 million or so people living in this country. So when you're thinking about, you got that many people and you divide that many billion by that many people, that's how you get down to those relatively small numbers of, $1,200, $500. The thing, Lance, the biggest criticism here I'm going to leave behind for people to think about, which I mentioned before with the first round, I think you and I were both critical of, is I feel like in both cases it just falls short, because is it nice to do this? Yes. Does it help some? Yes, but I think it's another one of those, and see if, I want to know if our listeners think this by the end of the show, because you know how I feel, Lance, but it feels like a lot of these things are half-baked, right? They're like, well, we feel like we need to do something, so we're going to do something, but none of this is long-term. We haven't really decided what that looks like, so we'll just come back to it later and hopefully figure it out. And what you get are these gaps like we've had now.
Yeah, we're just pushing the problem down the road. None of these are solving the problem. They're just stopgap measures, and we're pushing the real problems and the real discussions further down the road.
And if people want to follow along, it's a a New York Times article. It's linked at thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. That's our website. As always, articles are put there, and you can look at the charts for yourself. What I'm doing, Lance, as I go through here, you might do the same. I've got Republicans, Democrats, and then where I'd like to see a compromise between the two. And I'm making a tally as we go of whose idea I'm in favor of. I'm curious to see where we end up at the end of things. So the next one up is small business aid and business tax credits and deductions. So small business aid, Republicans have proposed more funding for paycheck protection loans, in addition to 2 other lending programs for small businesses. Democrats have not proposed additional loans at this time. The Republicans are proposing, Lance, a second draw on the Paycheck Protection Program, which would amount to about $90 billion versus the original $670 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, and a few other miscellaneous items there as well. The business tax credits and deductions portion, both parties have proposed expanding a payroll tax credit passed in March with slightly different parameters, but this may be, Lance, one of the ones where, yes, their amounts are different, but they're probably as close as you're going to get out of any of these categories. They're very comparable, like expanded tax credit to retain workers, $100 billion, the Republican plan, the Democrat plan, $164 billion. Right, tax credits for COVID-19 protection expenses, $50 billion versus $73 billion. So again, pretty comparable in that section. But that's what we're looking at in terms of business aid, but also tax credits and deductions.
Yes, the tax credit and deductions, like you said, their categories are even similar. They're just off. And again, sounds flippant to say this, but they're just a few $1 billion difference in the amount of money that they want to spend on it, but they both want to spend it very similarly. The big difference is with the small business aid, but even the Republicans who are offering money are only offering about 1/7 of what they offered back in July. So, businesses out there thinking, well, yeah, man, I want the Republicans because they're going to give me more money. Yeah, they're not going to give you much because, like you pointed out, from $670 billion down to $90 billion. So, the amount of money being made available to small businesses is very small. And as I pointed out to you, a lot of people very easily could say, well, see, there you go. The Democrats aren't doing anything for small business. But when you go over to the other category, the other provisions provide for a lot of people, and also the state and local government category where I think the Democrats are saying that's money that we're making available for small businesses. But when you just look at the small business aid chart, you're correct. The Democrats don't have anything there.
So then the last thing, Lance, we need to look at, right, is aid to state and local governments. That's the last thing for this segment. We've got lots more in the next one. And when we're looking at aid to state and local governments, this is another one of those areas here where we've got some pretty substantial differences just on the total, because I could go into the specifics, but we don't have time for that necessarily. The Republican plan essentially calls for $105 billion for state and local aid versus the Democrats' plan, which calls for roughly $1.18 trillion for their plan versus the $256 billion that's already been passed. So the Democrats are really going in on that state and local aid, and the Republicans are holding back pretty aggressively. And I told you before the show, I thought it was kind of ironic that we had the Democrats, at least at first glance, right? And you explained in some detail your thoughts there. But at first glance, it looks like, well, wait a minute. Why are the Democrats the ones that are suggesting that we give all this money to state and local governments, and the Republicans are the ones holding back? Shouldn't that be flipped around?
Yeah, typically you would think of it that way. But this is where, I think you have the Republicans and the president with, this is all coronavirus aid. The fact that the president said to the states, to the governors, rightly or wrongly, this is just the facts, said, you guys, you folks need to take care of this on your own. You need to buy your own ventilators. You need to, and yes, there were some dramatic gestures by the federal government to do certain things to help out. But if you are honest with everything, pretty much the states were put on their own and cities were put on their own to deal with the coronavirus. The president said this, you need to handle this locally, because as we've seen, outbreaks have taken place at different times in different municipalities and in different states. So the Republicans are saying, yeah, this is a state and local issue. You guys figure out how to fund it. And the Democrats are saying, well, if this is a coronavirus package, we, the federal government, need to help out the cities and the states because they've been hit really hard. And if we don't, we're going to see major cuts. Like the state of Ohio, they've already cut the education budget by 6% over the summer. And it's the new talks are they're going to cut it another 6 to 10%. And it all has to do with coronavirus and costs and all that kind of stuff. The Democrats are saying we need to help with that kind of stuff. The Republicans are saying, hey, your state decided to take care of it a certain way. You're responsible for your own debt.
Definitely the most extreme one. The other one will be safety net and other tax cuts, and that's part of what we're looking at coming up. We're going to lead off, Lance, the next segment. What's going on with unemployment benefits? What do Republicans and Democrats want to do there? And what about health care? If you get sick with COVID-19, what's going to happen? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Will you get another stimulus check from the government? Is there more money coming for small businesses? And what about your health care if you get COVID-19? Well, we've looked at some of that already, but we need to answer the questions about health care in this segment, along with unemployment benefits and some of the other provisions that are being discussed as well. First up, Lance, unemployment benefits, right? So far, we've had $274 billion passed to expand unemployment benefits. The Republicans are proposing spending $110 billion, and the Democrats are proposing spending $437 billion. Congress is facing increasing pressure to come to an agreement because weekly unemployment benefit payments of $600 expire for millions of Americans starting the week of July 30th. And so Republicans have proposed reducing the additional benefit, which is added to regular state payments, down to $200 per week through September, with a plan to set total benefits at 70% of lost income after that. Democrats want to continue the higher payments through January. And that's where you get the differences in spending.
When you talk about the stimulus checks and it being kind of a good thing, but it really doesn't solve the problem. It's the same thing here with the unemployment benefits. The 600 probably helps people out. But again, it's still that stopgap measure because it's going to continue through January and we really don't know what's going to happen next. It doesn't take care of that whole idea of like we've talked about for years on this show, how much people are actually making. But the Republicans, they're throwing a carrot out there, and they're saying, well, here's a little bit, and you'll get 70% of your lost income. That's not bad, but the Democrats are basically saying we're going to reject anything that's less than the continuation of the $600 payments. So this really isn't a debatable point, at least this summer. It wasn't a debatable point for the Democrats. We're not going to come off of this stance. You got to come up to 600. The problem here is that we've now had the whole month of August and people haven't gotten this money. So that's at $600 a week or $200 a week. It's somewhere between $800 and $2,400 that people have had to do without that they had gotten this spring and early summer.
The disappointing thing, Lance, right, is that the bureaucracy of government, the politics are getting in the way of fully baked plans. And so we get a lot of these half-baked things because either they don't want to do it before the election, right? Or they're playing hardline and they're not willing to compromise. So you have Americans that are paying the price on both sides, because you have both sides that are doing that on certain things. And the American people are the ones that are suffering. So the next thing that we're looking at, and this is the other area that we mentioned at the end of the last segment, Lance, the other big difference area is the safety net and individual tax cuts, right? So all told so far, the Congress has passed $83 billion in safety net and individual tax cuts. However, what's being proposed now is $18 billion, just $18 billion by Republicans versus Democrats' $736 billion proposal. So a pretty substantial difference. Just for the quick breakdown there for people, what Republicans want to spend money on is child care and development grants, along with more housing support, while Democrats want to do the same thing, but substantially more in both categories, including some elimination of SALT deductions for 2 years, hazard pay fund for essential workers, more food assistance, and tax credits and deduction workers for childcare. So for healthcare and childcare workers. So they add some things that the Republicans don't have at all, and the things the Republicans do have, they want to do like tenfold.
Exactly. And, the other big difference here that I see that I don't think you mentioned, $190 billion in the Democrats' plan as hazard pay for essential workers, which we've heard a lot about, and the Republicans are really just giving it, you pick up the salt shaker and you're going to salt your vegetables just a little bit. I'm just going to put a little bit of salt there. $15 billion for child care and development grants, like you said, compared to over $35 billion in housing, $3 billion to $202 billion. Again, that makes sense. When you think of Democrats, right? They want to keep people in their homes. They're trying to help out the people that are a little worse off. Child tax credit, that's for people who have money who need that money to help take care of their kids. Food assistance, those kinds of things are typical Democratic support things that Republicans don't usually want to spend money on. So it is a big gap, though, and it'd be interesting to see how big of a sticking point it becomes.
So the other thing that we got to look at is healthcare, because this is something obviously a lot of people on a lot of people's minds right now. Whether or not you need it at this moment, there's always that possibility that you will indeed need it. Particularly, what happens if you get sick, for example, with COVID. So when we look at healthcare, $277 billion, Lance, so far that's been passed by Congress. Democrats are proposing $382 additional billion versus Republicans $111 billion. Again, a lot of the same categories here. A couple of differences, but the main difference is Republicans want to spend less and the Democrats want to spend more. This again, though, Lance, it seems like, right, should be an area where they could find some middle ground here. The Republicans could say we're willing to spend more, and the Democrats could say, hey, we're willing to spend a little less. Let's get something done on this, as opposed to continuing to push it down the road.
Well, because the categories of both sides are basically the same, it's just a dollar amount. You hope that does give them a little more agreement. I don't know how you get somebody to spend $1 on something that they didn't even list as a need. At least with healthcare, they're both pretty much saying, yeah, we need to do something there, The Democrats are just, as you pointed out, wanting to do about 3 times what the Republicans want to do. The Republicans are, offering about half of what has already been done. The Democrats are just increasing what's already been done by about a third.
Again, keeping in mind, I think this is an important note. Part of the difference in the spending levels isn't just that they don't always agree 100% on what they're doing, but when they do agree, Republicans are often looking at it for half the time span that the Democrats are looking at it. So in so many cases, part of what I think people have to understand is they're really not disagreeing about how much money, say, per day or per week should be allocated. They're disagreeing about for how long it should be allocated. And I think that's really important to understand, because so many of these areas, they're in agreement on they need to do something about it. And they're in agreement on a week-to-week basis about what should be spent. There are some areas where that's not the case. I think the glaring examples are the state and local aid, and then obviously the small business aid are the ones where you've got Republicans basically saying we need to do more than we were doing before, and basically the Democrats are radio silence, at least at the moment, on small business aid. And then on your state and local aid, you've got Republicans saying, well, we'll do a little something, and you've got the Democrats saying we'll do a heck of a lot. We'll do over $1 trillion in state and local aid. So those are the ones that seem like the glaring ones that they're going to have to address. All the other stuff, to me, Lance, are ones where you would think they could find some of that. And again, I think that's demonstrated here as well in the last bit, the other provisions category, which, by the way, includes things like agriculture aid, Republicans proposing $20 billion for that versus Democrats $31 billion, other defense spending, defense contractors, airports.
But this is where the categories aren't even close.
Right.
You mentioned agriculture, and that's it.
That's the only one.
That's the only one that's similar. Then the Republicans, with their $81 billion total, want to help defense contractors, other FBI, and international aid. Whereas the Democrats, with their basically $300 billion online, are helping out with higher education, retirement and pension plans, the agriculture, which you mentioned, more money for the post office, which was in the original plan. There was $10 billion for the post office loans. The Democrats want another $25 billion. The Democrats are trying to do some student loan forgiveness, which student aid was in the original, but now it's a little bit different. So, I mean, in this one, the Democrats are trying to cover a lot of things that I think are partially to cover up why they don't have anything in small business. But as far as let's sit down at the table and negotiate some kind of agreement, they don't even have the same categories, even though it's the catch-all group. Could be a real stumbling block, along with the fact that the Democrats are saying they're not coming off the $600 a week unemployment, because they're not even talking about the same things. One's talking about apples and one's talking about oranges.
Looks like the farmers will get some money, though, if they actually get anything agreed on, because they do both want that. But like Lance said, other than that, the categories are pretty much none of them match up. And I think that speaks to the big categories, the things that affect pretty much all of us, immediately. The hope, I guess, for people, the positive, right, that you could take away from all of this is, hey, they are in agreement in a lot of these areas that something needs to be done. They're disagreeing about how much, or, as I pointed out, which again I think is really important to hold on to, for how long.
Right.
And that's maybe one of those areas, Lance, because we're all about trying to find ways to actually get something done and move forward. Maybe that's where Democrats could compromise and say, okay, we'll do something for a shorter term, so therefore less money, but the Republicans will cede some ground and say, if certain benchmarks haven't been met, then we're okay automatically extending based on what the Democrats had agreed to.
This is a COVID-19 package, and therein is the political difference, unfortunately, on what's going to happen in the future. The Republicans are telling everybody we're going to have a vaccine by the end of November or the end of the year. And this is, where the president the other day said, we're turning the corner. Things are almost over. And the Democrats and some of the doctors are saying we're just entering into what was the second wave, and we never really entered the first wave. So I think that's part of the debate on how long things need to be in place, because there's a huge disagreement on where we are in the containment of the virus.
That's an excellent point. And the question, of course, is, so what will happen? Will Congress do anything? It's election season after all. And is there a better option? Those are some of the things that Lance and I are going to answer. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
Is there more money coming for you? Well, that's what Congress is debating. They're looking at small business aid, stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, healthcare, and more. Lance and I broke down in the first and second segment so far kind of what's being proposed by both sides, right? And what are the key differences? One of the biggest differences, I think, that we can't stress enough is the duration component. And that's also kind of where Lance left us off, right? The two messages we're getting. The message from the Republicans, right, that we're turning the corner, vaccines on the horizon, it's not going to be that much longer. The message from the Democrats, it's really bad, it's probably going to stay bad for a while, we need to be prepared for that. So different, and unfortunately, I think, and this is something that both people have to take away, which I think the listeners to this show, Lance, right, they're probably pretty intelligent humans. I'm giving our listeners a little credit here. But if they're tuning in and they stick with us and they make it to the third segment every week with us, then they probably care about this stuff and they probably get this. But hopefully you've drawn the connection, right, that unfortunately both sides have politicized this. And when you think about the responses or the messages they're pushing, right, they favor them in the election season. If things are turning the corner and they're almost over, well, that's good for the president and the Republicans, right, because their leadership has led us through the crisis and it's almost here. We can see tomorrow. And for the Democrats, if the crisis is still pretty bad and there's a long time to go and we got to change leadership because we're not going to get out of it if we don't, that is a message that obviously pushes Joe Biden toward the presidency, and the Democrat message, elect more Democrats and we'll get things fixed. So both of them benefit from the messages that they're pushing. Whether or not the messages they're pushing are true or not, that's kind of that mixed bag you and I have talked about, Lance. I just wanted to share, because I told you at the beginning I would do this. I did tally as we went through Republicans, Democrats, and the things I wanted them to compromise on. We had eight different categories that we walked you through in the first and second segment, 4 in each. And I came down, Lance, with 1 for the Republicans, 1 for the Democrats, and 6 that I would prefer they compromise on. So again, that's kind of, I think, speaks to as well their approaches to the categories, where a lot of those categories were things they agreed on the same areas, they just disagreed about how much money. And I'd like to see an in-between approach, or something like I mentioned at the end of the last segment, let's see how it goes for the next 3 or 4 months. And then, once we reach that point, let's have some automatic things in place so that we're not going through the negotiation again, because that's where the American people suffer.
Congress can sit there and the political parties can politicize this, and we as individuals have the right to have our own view as to who's right and who's wrong. But what's happening is there are problems. There are people that are hungry. There are people without insurance. There are people who are being evicted from their homes, and nothing's being done for them. It's still summer. It's still warm outside. You're not trying to pay a heating bill. But as we enter those parts of the country where winter's pretty rough, this is really scary when you think about this has gone on during the warmer seasons when people can be outside, and it's a little easier to survive March through September and October than it is in a lot of the country from November to March. Because it is election season, you would think it would behoove both sides to get something done, because they've both been on break back home campaigning. That's why we have this Labor Day break. It's not because Congress works so hard. It's because they want to go back home and knock on doors and have fundraisers and see their constituents so that they can get reelected. And so that's what they've been doing. They've been campaigning. Now they're going to go back to Washington. And it's like, okay, you've seen how rough it is, and will they make a decision? We're not going to make a decision, unfortunately, in my opinion, based on the needs of the people. We're going to make a decision based on, well, is my side going to win the election or not? This is getting politicized, and we're not solving the problem. And because we don't even agree on what the problem is. That's how far this has gone over the last 3 or 4 months. We as a nation don't even agree on if there is a problem or not and how bad the problem is. And so how in the world can we get any kind of solution among the two sides when we don't even agree on what the problem is and how bad the problem is?
It is so infuriating that is the point we've arrived at in this country. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are dead, and we don't have a consensus on the path forward. How are we to navigate a global pandemic without a clear agreement on what the tactic is? Because we haven't even decided that. There was that article, Lance, that I shared with you that had to do with, look, right? There really are two ways that other countries have seen success approaching this, and we tried both, and we didn't stick with either. And so now we've got exactly what we're in right now, where way more people than are necessary, right, have died because it's been politicized and because both sides would rather blame the other side for their ineffectiveness than actually do anything about solving the problem, because guess what? It happens to be an election year. So too bad for the millions of Americans that are either dying because of COVID or because of the economic toll that it's taken, are in a terrible position. Too bad, because we'd rather win an election than actually do anything for the people. And that is, I think, the real crime in all of it is not the particulars of any of this stimulus stuff that we've gone over. It's the motivation behind, like Lance said, the break is not because they've been working hard. It's because they want to go campaign. And you, the American people, are sitting at home and suffering while they go out and do that.
The deaths are the worst part, but we haven't been able to control the infection rate. Now, New York City has, and so they're moving forward. But, you look at the other countries around the world who have had some success as the deaths being the worst part, but we can't get the infection rates under control. And that's going to mean the virus is going to continue to be here. It's just silly. And for me that we can't agree to get that straight and try something and dedicate ourselves, because that's always been, to me, what it meant to be an American, is to be, we're going to pull together and we're going to wipe out the enemy. And I've watched us the last 6 months pull apart at a time when historically Americans tend to pull together. So, the question is there something better? Get along. Let's solve the problem. Let's get through this and let's come out the other side and let's get back to doing the things that we've always done as Americans to make this the best country in the world to live in. I'm not saying that as a rah-rah flag waver, even though I am. I'm not saying it for that reason. I'm saying it that, folks, if you travel the world, we have a great place to live. We have a lot of problems, and we need to solve those problems. And I'm right in the forefront leading the charge to let's solve these problems. And I think we really have some issues, some deep-seated issues that we need to solve. But I'd still rather be here solving them. I'm sick and tired of being here and fighting. I'm sick and tired of not working for solutions to these problems. So is there a better option? Yeah, the better option is let's put aside our differences and pull together as American citizens and solve these problems like we have in the past. When faced with attacks from the outside, be it viruses back in 1918 or from outside forces in World War I and World War II, we pull together. And that's the better option, is to pull together as a nation, put aside our differences, and find some common ground and solutions. That's the better option.
And this article that I'm referencing was in the Wall Street Journal, and they point out there's basically 3 approaches that countries that have seen success have opted for. And you'll know when I list them off, you'll be like, well, we've kind of tried all 3. The first one's pretty straightforward, which is just to stay open, right? Which is basically to say, yes, COVID is real, and we're going to do funding to take care of people that get sick. But for the most part, we're just pretty much going to stay open, and the people that get sick, and we want to keep the economy healthy in exchange for accepting the larger number of deaths that occur if we go this route. There's the other side of that, right? The kind of the opposite, which is to say, let's close down and stay closed until we know we're through it or we have a vaccine, right? And let's take care of people while they're home, and we'll do the deficit spending as necessary to make sure everybody stays alive. That minimizes the death toll, but obviously hurts the economy pretty bad. So you've got the save the economy or save the most number of lives possible. And then you've got the hybrid approach of that, which is you open up, right? You keep the economy going, but you are absolutely rigorous about the requirements for when people are in public, when people are going to school, and you provide aid for the people that's truly not an option for. Unfortunately, we've not done any of those long enough for any of them to be effective, and most of the time, we've done many of those half-assed. For example, we're kind of trying the hybrid thing right now, and when I say trying, we're basically kind of sort of doing it in some parts of the country, but we're not doing it very well, even in those places. And that's the problem. You have to choose one of them. Everybody's got to be on the page about that's what we're going with. And then you have to commit to doing it for more than a month or two at a time. That doesn't cut it on any of those options. They're long-term, multi-month, possibly multi-year approaches. And we all just got to drill down and decide here's what we're going to go with. And in any of those, there's hurt, right? Whether it's economic hurt, whether it's the death toll, whether it's you can't behave in public the way you're used to, there's going to be that effect. But we have to make that conscious decision to make those sacrifices. And like Lance said, pull together and get through it. Because the longer we squabble, the longer this goes on for. So Lance?
I got nothing to add. That's it, right? How many times have you heard me say, if you don't take care of a problem, it just gets worse.
Yep.
And then then it's harder to deal with it. So as you point out, we've put this off, which means we're still going to have to deal with it. Now we're going to have to deal with it longer than we would have if we had done something and stuck with it from the beginning.
Tell our listeners, Lance, why did we have this conversation, right? You and I think we told people pretty well how we felt today. And we broke it down for people, gave them the information, gave them our thoughts. But what are we doing that for? Why is our company, what are we working on?
Well, because Justin and Lance get mad and they just got to tell people what's going on and hopefully get people to convert to our side. And
is that our new mission statement?
No, that's my mission statement for today.
Okay.
The question you asked was, what's True Chat's mission, our company? Well, mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And the important part is, if you agree with us or you just want to have a conversation with somebody over what we've talked about, you've got to get the word out. It does us some good for you to listen, but we want more people to listen, more people to get involved in the conversation so we can come to those agreements and move forward on some of these issues and get them solved so that we can, all live in a better place. So, you're talking to your friends, tell them, you got to listen to The State of Us. And they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is released as a podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. in the Eastern Time Zone. We're also a syndicated radio program, so be sure to check your local stations on the weekends. Like Lance said, the more of us we get tuning in, the more likely we are to make some changes here. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, and our editing producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.